I remember somebody describing compact as like something or other, some right-wing reference point meets gray zone. And that, you know, might or might not be fair for any given author at compact, but I do expect, you know, like I do expect them often to have sort of capital A, capital I, anti-imperialist sort of takes, and Zizek, for better or worse, is not that. And this article is definitely him being not that. So, and you know, actually, I would say not better or worse, for better and worse, better in some ways, worse in others.
Interesting.
You know, we'll get to it. But he says in an interview with Russian state TV this month, Victor Bout, the international arms dealer freed by the United States in exchange for basketball star Brittany Griner, who, by the way, remains the only person in jail for smoking weed that Joe Biden has ever secured the release of. His pardon was so narrowly tailored that in the U.S. it didn't actually free anybody, but it's expunged some people's records who'd already been out. But revealed that he had sent a private message to former President Donald Trump urging him to flee to Russia for safety. Most likely, he will simply be eliminated in America, Boots said. Therefore, I think it's the best interest of all of humanity, and primarily all of the Russian people, all of humanity, wow, to invite Donald Trump here to Russia to give him security and protection here. This would allow Trump to continue this uprising against the globalists. And I will, you know, I mean, look, not a Trump fan, but be fair, he has a globalist son-in-law. And protect American people from elimination. Absurd as it may sound, this proposal of a direct alliance between today's Russia and Trumpian populism and a shared revolt against the globalists renders perfectly the underlying ideological project of Russia. It's an effort to construct a new multipolar world where even the citizens of the nations that dominate today's global order will be liberated. Thus, when Vladimir Putin declares that America has nothing to offer the world except domination, he is attacking the United States as a global power that at the same time exploits the majority of the American people for whom Trump supposedly speaks. And America pursuing Trump's America First policy would fit perfectly with the vision outlined by Putin in the October 2022 speech, in which the Russian strongman called on the nations of the non-aligned world to join Moscow in building a new multipolar world to supplant the U.S.-led Atlantic order. So this is going to be, you know, this is what he's sort of taking aim at in this article, is the way that in Putinist rhetoric, the sort of bad, you know, the bad imperialist thing is unipolarity, and the good, desirable, enlightened thing would be multipolarity. And I guess the first thing to say about this is, like, you know, I want to hear from Jordan, and then, you know, if Andy wants to join in, but is that whatever else you want to say about Slavoj's perspective on this, he's not wrong that multipolarity, in the way that the Victor Boots of the world mean by it, is like an incredibly unappealing vision.
Well, I think as someone who studied international relations and the theoretical side of this, like, my ears start to burn and steam when I hear about polarity at any given conversation, because few people take the time to lay out what that means and jump straight into some sort of normative conception of what polarity is the best polarity. And I think we have to kind of start from, you know, just the fundamental conception of polarity first, and then move to different conceptions of the types of polarity that exist, and then only a little bit later get to not an ideological conception of polarity, but straight to, you know, what multipolarity means in Russia and for Russia, and in Russia in particular. It's been a doctrine in foreign policy since the fall of the Soviet Union, and it means something a little bit different in terms of a way that they are trying to achieve it, and to what ends, than it does just in the greater theoretical conception in international relations. So polarity in and of itself is just the distribution of power in an international, or even just a regional global context between nation states. That the only people that matter in international relations theory, in a realist perspective at least, are states themselves. And obviously you can have different types of polarity, however that power is distributed. Unipolarity would mean you have one hegemon. There's one superpower in the world. Bipolarity, too. That would be like in the Cold War, for example, where we had America and the Soviet Union, and they were both superpowers and the greatest blocks that regionally other countries could kind of fall within their sphere of influence, internationally as well. And then multipolarity is a state in which there is no main superpower in control. There's no single hegemon. There's no two-party bloc, but different poles. And it doesn't mean that every state is a pole in and of itself. It's still a measure of power of a country. So we can say that before World War I, at least, in like the 19th century, like after the fall of Napoleon, for example, we had a multipolar world, multipolar Europe in particular. After World War I, we had bipolarity in the Cold War. And after the fall of the Soviet Union, then you can get into the question of whether we're back into multipolarity or unipolarity. Is the US the main hegemon, or is there something else that's going on? And that is like a place where there is no consensus for a really long time. Something that I have to point out before I pass the mic back is just that this is a descriptor. This is just purely descriptive. It's something that you look at empirically, the system as it stands now, and you say, this country has power. And by power, again, in realist terms, we mean money and guns. That's basically all that it comes down to. That's how you create influence in an anarchic, international community where no one has any real claim to power, not ideologically or otherwise, beyond the influence that they have on the states around them for the sake of their security. So, getting into whether a certain type of polarity is good or bad, or what it means into the rise of empires and the fall of empires, that's where things start to get a little hazy. And you can talk about the stability between a unipolar, multipolar, bipolar world. We could talk about proneness to war, certainly. But in terms of what type of polarity is the best type of polarity, you're going to start getting into normative conceptions and ideological ones almost immediately. And that kind of stands against everything that I care about in a realist international relations perspective. So that's that.
Yeah, well, let's get into the ideological conception. Says
Russia wants to create a multipolar world in the sense that they can't have a bipolar world anymore after the fall of the Soviet Union, but they can take anti-American sentiment from around the world and try to create bilateral relations with different countries against America in a sort of similar way that the Soviet Union was a counterbalance to American hegemony back in the day. But whether or not Russia would actually be one of the main poles in terms of its power and influence in a modern sense is really difficult to say. They're not as strong as they'd like to think, certainly, or as they might look despite what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, I think they've certainly shown in the last year that they're not, that they're not that strong, like granted with, a rival power refueling the tank of the Ukrainian military over and over again, but, also not exactly unprecedented in terms of proxy wars during the Cold War. The total inability of Russia to even roll over its immediate neighbor, I mean, like is pretty telling. And I mean, like they have their, and like they have really, really wanted China to help them out with that, and they really haven't. You know, they've been like, it's kind of like, well, look, we're not going to cut you off, and we'll say nice things about you. But that's what you're getting from us, right? Like, at least for right now, you're not getting, like, for example, any drones from us, which would be a big deal if it happened, which is, you know, maybe says something about the change in the level of power that those two countries have now.
Right.
But Slavoj writes, thus, so it's an effort to create a new multipolar world where even the citizens, the nations that dominate today's global order will be liberated. Thus, when, okay, blah, blah, blah. So this is a Putin quote, I believe. Real democracy in a multipolar world, first of all, presupposes the possibility for any nation, any society, and any civilization to choose their own way, their own socio-political system, except for the Ukrainians. If the United States and the European Union countries have this right, the Asian countries, the Islamic states, the monarchies, the Persian Gulf, the states of other continents certainly have that as well.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it?
Yes.
I can't say that I've ever equated polarity or multipolarity with democracy in any way, shape, or form. The internal domestic ruling structures of the nations themselves have nothing to do with the international system, unless you're taking it from, like, the liberal, and I don't mean like shit lib perspective. I mean, in international relations, you have realism, which just focuses on economic and military power, and you have the liberal side that, you know, if you've heard listeners of Francis Fukuyama and the end of history, and so the fall of the Soviet Union means that America wins, and that the dominant force in the world from now on is going to be liberalism and democracy, and we're going to have all sorts of different, you know, variations of peace based on economic relations and more countries becoming democratic and all of that. And so that's the liberal tradition of international relations theory. And so if it's always really funny, like, I'm reading this article again, and by the way, I sent you earlier, Zizek also published in Die Welt an article specifically just on China. Mm-hmm. And it's like exactly this article, except he added a few other little things about Trump and Russia to the beginning of it for compact, but it's more or less exactly the same. And he's talking about the promise of democracy and these sort of like Eurocentric conceptions, what would exist in multipolarity and universalism and all of this. And like, they have really nothing to do with polarity. They're not part of the promise of multipolarity in the least. So when he goes on to speak about true democracy in a multipolar system, it's like a very liberal sort of take. The polarity itself has a lot less to do with the power balance in the world and more these ideological concepts that we can kind of take for granted, really. Those things change.
I mean, in a way, I mean, because you're right. Like, clearly, there's a level at which this is like a total non sequitur. What is the balance of power between different countries in the world have to do with what the internal political system is? Those are, but this seems like what this is Putin sort of doing his version of, I mean, if he were. If he were trying to justify himself on leftist grounds, like if he still had the ideology that he had in the 80s, rather than trying to justify himself on the grounds of, I don't know, Russian Orthodox Christianity or whatever, his current justification is, he would probably be using the phrase anti-imperialism here somewhere. It's because the thought seems to be roughly the same, that you see the world as sort of divided between the bad, the bad imperial hegemon and everybody else who's the, axis of resistance or whatever to that. And this is the part. I mean, there is stuff in this article I disagree with, but I mean, this is the part that I think that Slavoj is most convincing on. That like the sort of nonsensicalness. I mean, putting aside the multipolarity thing for a second, I guess this is supposed to be, or I don't know, I guess the link is supposed to be that this is going to be like one of the benefits of multipolarity, that if you, that if the United States can't push you around, you can have whatever system you want to have.
Yeah, like America has been so invested in stopping democracy from popping up around the world, right? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
that makes a lot of sense.
I mean, especially, so his list includes the Asian countries, the Islamic states, the monarchies, the Persian Gulf states of other continents certainly have it as well. I mean, we all remember how hard the United States worked to stop the monarchies of the Persian Gulf from doing their thing. But famously, right? No, we will have no truck with you or your orbs. But the equation of everybody getting to like whatever sort of despot or theocratic elite or whoever, just getting to do their own thing in their own country with democracy in this sleight of hand. I mean, like this is I think what he's most convincingly pushing back against, right? He says, in an abstract sense, these claims may sound convincing. Surely the most fundamental of democratic rights is the right of each country to freely choose its own socio-political system with a view towards its own self-interest. Putin and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping met in Moscow last month. They made the same point. Their gathering report, the Washington Post, showed the two countries' commitment to creating a new world order, one where the United States no longer the arbiter of everything that happens at the global stage. But what about, say, the recent Iranian protests against compulsory hijab and its vicious enforcement by the Islamic Republic? This uprising triggered by women provides the best counter-argument against the new world order of sovereign states. If ever there was an event that's not Eurocentric, it's the Iranian protest movement, which grows out of unresolved antagonisms internal to Iranian society. Western patronizing satisfaction, finally Iranians are becoming like us, is totally out of place. If anything, we in the West should learn from the Iranian people. Indeed, references to Western democracy and human rights can also serve as an index of authentic protest. Protesters may use this reference even if their activity isn't in any way Eurocentric. Key paragraph, such uprisings put the lie to the cynical attempt by authoritarian regimes today to frame their own people's yearning for emancipation as impositions of Western power. Color revolutions.
Yeah.
They also make it resoundingly clear that those who are committed to emancipatory politics must reject the authoritarian multipolarity that's sort of on offer for the likes of Putin. That last sentence is a little bit ambiguous, but I do want to pause here to give you a chance to kind of sound off on all of this.
Sure. By the way, I think, like you said, that Zizek, putting certain issues that I have aside, which I won't put aside for too long, he does make a few really good arguments here. But the funny thing is that, like, when you look at it on the whole, the thing that makes the least sense about this being published in compact is not that it's particularly conservative, and it's certainly not that it's particularly anti what's the word I'm looking for? Like he's kind of arguing for involvement. It's very neoconservative, if it's anything, and that's definitely not what compact is. Like, he's going to go on to talk a little bit about social democratic free markets in China, and he's going to speak about a few other things here. But what he talks about, the authoritarian regimes desperately try to construct an external enemy to obfuscate their own imminent antagonisms, and all of this, like, reject authoritarian multipolarity of the sort on offer from the likes of Putin. He's saying we should reject Putin's concept of multipolarity because what it doesn't do is actually offer democracy in a greater sense for the rest of the world. If you think that you are being anti-imperialist by going up against the United States in particular in the war in Ukraine, then you're missing the point that there are other imperial powers at play here, namely Russia and China, which again, like something that you can take issue with to a certain degree, and I will later with the Chinese part. But the point is that like we're not supposed to jump on board for multipolarity the way that Putin is presenting it and the way that he says we get to it, which is just going against American powers, European like centric conceptions and all of that, the multipolarity where everyone has their fair say and play on the field and all they have to do is align with Russia against America. It's a pretty silly thing. And I see a lot of leftists falling for this pretty sadly, constantly. Since the war in Ukraine started, I think that there's a discounting on what the war in Ukraine is beyond it being a proxy for great powers in a sort of Cold War setting, but actually that the Ukrainian people are fighting against Russian aggression and occupation at the moment. This is not democracy that's being fought for in Ukraine either. We're not fighting on the side of democracy by supporting Ukraine. Like there's a lot of things that kind of need to be unpacked and weird narratives that we have to walk away from. They are fighting a war of defense. They are fighting for national sovereignty. None of this has anything to do with polarity in the sense of, you know, who you're going to put your weight behind for the outcome of it. You know, there's a right and a wrong only in the sense of Russia started the war and Ukraine is fighting it. But joining on the Ukrainian side for the sake of unipolarity, for American imperialism, or fighting against the Americans in the name of anti-imperialism, all of these are totally misguided. Just as much as the Putin propaganda that he's talking about here, it doesn't make any sense. A lot of the Western propaganda against China and Russia also makes very little sense.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's, both of those are sort of treating the United States as the sort of only significant actor in all of this in a weird way, which, obviously like other, this is, this is kind of a lot of what was going on in my discussion with Norm a few weeks ago that like I don't think sort of treating the United States as the only active element in the situation. Everybody else is just sort of reacting to it.
Exactly.
I think it's kind of absurd that it's like obviously, there are other powers that have their own interests and their own agendas, and they're gonna act in the world, on the basis of that, and whatever. I guess I just I would have the old-fashioned commie view that that the workers have no country, but I guess before actually, so two things before we go on. One is that Andy did some artwork here.
That's awesome.
People listening to this later as a podcast. Actually, you know what? I'm not gonna. Andy, do you want to talk us through this?
Yeah, I kind of misheard what Jordan said, so I'm just sitting there like what is this Artos thing? Oh, it's a fascist magazine. I thought it was a Pirate Toast magazine. So I drew a pirate,
Toast.
And he goes, I thought it was our toast. My Pirate Toast magazine is a fascist magazine.
It's so sad when the fascist magazines take over the pirate magazines. It's really unfair.
Yeah.
Man.
Yep.
Need good
okay.
toast.
I loved it. Yeah, not that I'm directing people there, except if you want to go see what really freaky stuff looks like in the comments, like on Instagram, Arctos, it's ARKTOS. I think it's based in Sweden, and it's just the absolute worst ideas that I've seen spread around in the grossest
I mean, a far right magazine based in Sweden. I mean, this is like the publishers are like the bad guys for the girl with the dragon tattoo.
Literally 100% that. Yeah. Yeah. God damn, that's really sad. Anyway,
awesome.
Absolutely. And Norm came into my mind when I was reading through this and looking through things as well, because the thing that kind of boggles my mind the most about his take, it's not just that surely, Russia has like its own security considerations, and there's certainly things here that we need to take seriously, but he also verges into an incredibly idealistic conception that the most important thing to do is to try to understand Putin's mind,
Right.
and these like grand historical narratives, and to put things in context in that way. And you know what? That had a place a year and 2 months ago when we were on the brink of this thing, and the question was if there was any way to de-escalate in an immediate sense. But now, no, this machine is already, the wheels are turning on their own, and it's working just in a totally different way beyond what's going on in Putin's mind. All we have to do is unpack his trauma from, bombs exploding overhead and all of that.
Well, I mean, also a point I made in that discussion is if we're going to play the game of sort of sympathizing with nationalist leaders because of their World War II based trauma, that might lead places where Norman Finkelstein of all people would not like.
Yeah, I don't understand how that doesn't really occur to him. And Zizek is pointing out the hypocrisy of claims here. So if we're going to be on the line of the hypocrisy of claims or the blindness to certain realities, then that's something that I genuinely don't understand how Norm is lost on that. But the funniest thing in that whole conversation when he was talking about like the regrets of positions that he had in his youth haunting him for his whole life was like, you're so close. Just add another one to the list.
Yeah, you're doing it again. Gotta break the cycle, rise above.
Yes.
Okay.
This is your opportunity.
So it says, yes, the liberal West is hypocritical. It applies its high standards very selectively. But hypocrisy means you violate the standards you proclaim, and in this way you open yourself up to imminent criticism. We criticize the way liberal West, we use its own standards. What Russia is offering in contrast is a world without hypocrisy, because it is without global ethical standards. The only meaningful ethical imperative is to practice a pragmatic respect for differences. We've seen clearly what this means when after the Taliban retook Afghanistan, they immediately made a deal with China. Beijing would accept the new Afghanistan, while the Taliban would ignore what China is doing to its Uyghur Muslim population. This, I don't know how you're supposed to pronounce that, new globalization advocated by Russia. We should assert, on the contrary, that the only way to defend what is worth saving in our liberal tradition is to ruthlessly insist on its universality.
That's where Dugin really does come into the picture when it comes to Russian ideological apologia. Is he's saying no, universalism, that's the Eurocentric Western concept with all of your universal values of liberalism and all of that. We have our own truths, and relativism is the best way to approach the world. So if we have multipolarity, it's not really going to be about democracy everywhere. It's going to be you do you and we do what we do, and no one's going to bother anybody, and no one's going to bother anybody being America not imposing their hypocritical standards on the world.
Yeah, I back in like 2021 or something, Vard and I did a Thursday, or maybe it was still Sunday night, debate breakdown where we looked at the Alien versus Predator debate between Alexander Dugin and Bernard-Henri Lévy.
Whoa.
Yeah. Whoever wins, we lose, right? And that was the thing that really hit me the hardest about that Dugin is, I think he's not entirely consistent about it, but I mean, he has a but certainly in that debate, you know, I mean, he was just really blatantly, like, I mean, like the guy's like a caricature of a postmodernist, you know, that he has, it's like, hey, you can have your Western truths. That's nice for you. We have our own Russian truths. Just don't go trying to impose your Western truths, you know, on us Russians. And of course, you know, obviously, you know, you know, this is like the, you know, line Trey Reed always uses about how the sort of absurdity of pretending that there's like a single like that, like black people in the United States are a hive mind politically. It's like, you know, it's like there are, you know, there are more black people in the United States than there are people in Canada. You know, like we don't think there's a Canadian view on anything, right? You know, how is it that we think there's a Black American view on anything? And it's like, man, I mean, there are even more Russians than that. I'm pretty sure at least some of them disagree with Dugin. You know, like certainly people who've, you know, in the last year who've been beaten and imprisoned, you know, for opposing the war in Ukraine.
Sure.
But you know, those people don't count, you know, because it's the real thing is this sort of mysterious Russian collective consciousness that like he also said in that debate that that individual people don't have rights against society as a whole any more than your limbs have rights against the rest of your body.
There you go. We could be clearer than that.
Yeah.
The heart
He
wants
also
what
said
it wants.
that
The
he's
leg
not
wants what it wants, you know. Over there.
He also said he's not a fascist because you know, essentially fascism is a product of the modern world.
And
So,
he's an old soul. Is that what it was?
yeah.
Orthodoxy pre-exists fascism, so there's no possible way that those things could have anything to do with one another.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Xi may have allied with Putin to advance China's strategic interests, but China can't be said to advocate for the Russian version of the New World Order, not in any uncomplicated way at any rate. For more than a century, it has been following another project, Pan-Asianism. So this is where it gets into the article you sent me, which was from a German magazine. Is that right?
Yeah, Devout the World. Exactly. That one was specifically like, if you want to understand modern day China, then you have to understand, can't remember the actual title here. Hold on. To understand the China of today, we must understand Wang Hui, who he'll go on to talk about here with regards to Pan-Asianism. And by the way, I did a little bit of research and snooping and speaking to my sources who will remain unnamed about claims here about Pan-Asianism in China. But it seems like, what do they mean by Pan-Asianism? I'm sure a lot of people who are listening have heard of Pan-Arabism, Pan-Africanism. There are these movements within the last century that are meant to be sort of transnational, regional concepts. Yeah. But the Pan-Asianism of China is really more of a pan-China-ism of the unification of China. And that doesn't start just in the 19th century, the end of the 19th century, and just before the revolution in China, but it's like a larger, grander conception that can be better understood as sort of like pan-Christendom, or like a desire for a unified ummah within the Arab world. It's got a much longer history than what is being given credited here, but interesting. I'm curious why.
I've got my suspicions about the identity of your sources, but I'm not going to rat you out. Should also say, so there was this really interesting thing that happened, say in France, I think. There was the, somewhere in Europe, I think France, the Chinese ambassador to that country had said some sort of like crazily pro-Putin things about Ukraine, like way beyond what like the normal line of the Chinese government is. And it was a whole little mini scandal. You know, one of the things I was reading about, though, and this immediately made me think of Andy, said that this particular Chinese diplomat had long been known as a representative of, wait for it, wolf warrior diplomacy.
Yes.
Why do you what yes? What does this mean?
So Andy is obsessed with this Chinese movie, Wolf Warrior.
Yes.
Wow.
Specifically part 2. Part 1's not great.
Okay, good to know.
There's a part 3 coming out. I'm looking forward to this. But Wolf Warrior 2 was a very jingoistic pro-Chinese movie about imperialism, but like Chinese imperialism specifically, and how it looks in Africa and how they see Africans. And it's a fascinating film for so many levels because like it better than anything else I've ever seen, like gives you this idea of the modern Chinese like how they see themselves in the world than anything I've ever seen or read. And you also have a great scene where like a dude drives a truck through a hospital, hops out and starts fighting a Russian that's twice his size.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, like
2015.
Yeah, it is one of the largest, the biggest grossing films of that year. It beat out a couple superhero films too.
Damn.
Which is amazing.
Well,
and
I know I'll be watching Wolf Warrior 2 this evening.
Yeah. You don't need to watch Wolf Warrior 1. Nothing really important. Wolf Warrior 1's interesting. I mean, you got Scott Adkins being the villain, which is fun. And they do have this opening scene where they're busting a drug dealer and they do the Miranda rights. which
definitely exists in China.
Yeah, weirdest thing I've seen, but like Wolf Warrior 1's a bit of a hot mess. That does end in a lot of jingoism, because
that's a lot of Chinese movies that have to get past their censor.
But Wolf Warrior 2 is a special kind of movie because it kind of shows you how they see their imperialism. It shows you this weird racism that they have against Africans, like how they see Africans, which is also just fascinating. And the phrase Wolf Warrior has actually taken on like this cultural meaning in China, which is also just incredibly interesting to kind of see. It's like almost the way Top Gun kind of like infested our
gotcha.
Everybody wanted to be a maverick, like Maverick. John McCain and what's his name who pretended the movie was based on him but really wasn't.
So Wolf Warriors are the Mavericks of China, is what I'm meant to understand here.
Yes.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Thank you. I learned something today. There we go.
Yeah. All right.
So he's saying that that the kind of Pan-Asianism that he's talking about here is like a movement against a European imperialism and a European conception of individualism, and it's more about collective movement, and even more so in a modern time, a radical collective movement, which in the article where he lifts a lot of, is basically this article, but without certain elements, that Wang Wei, here we go, I see him here. He's really more of a proponent of like a social democratic style of economy, but in terms of his Chinese conceptions, he's still pretty much a decent Maoist. But the issue with Pan-Asianism and that anti-individualistic, collective struggle that they talk about is that it's prone to becoming socialist or fascist very easily, and it kind of tends to swing between the two. And he notes Japan as an example of the fascist side, but he also notes Yun Sen, who was like the grandfather of the revolution before Chiang Kai-shek, as being open to fascism, which is also something that my sources have told me is not really particularly true. He actually worked with the Communist Party within China, and Chiang Kai-shek is the one who was more flirting with fascism very openly, and this has been well documented. But anyway, that's the issue with Pan-Asianism. If we're going to be looking at it as like an anti-imperialist concept or an anti, American or Eurocentric one, is another one of the poles in the multipolarity, is that it has its own issues and they're not universal virtues, the ones that Zizek is so in love with.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I mean, I'm pretty much with him on the moral universalism. I mean, I really like the Amartya Sen point about this, that there's all this bullshit about that's propagated for obvious reasons by regimes and their supporters in different places about how Russians have their own Russian values, or like the Singaporean rulers say, oh, we have our own Asian values, that we don't need to have all these like rights for criminal defendants and stuff. And it's like the Amartya Sen point is like, yeah, I mean, it's sort of support for like individual rights, all this stuff. You can find this in any tradition. And he provides a lot of textual backup for that, right? I mean, which I think makes a certain amount of sense. Humans are humans, and cultural traditions are vast things. Within them and within their language, there are going to be people who are articulating both the kind of values that we would like and the kind that we wouldn't,
Sure.
and sort of saying that only one of these things is authentically really, the Asian tradition or whatever is very bullshitty.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, like you're saying, it's always a spectrum, and it tends to be the same sort of spectrum that gets expressed at different parts of the world at different points in time. Like why was the first 45 years of the 20th century in Europe and in the world so warring? There was an insane amount of hyper-nationalism. Why was the second half of the 20th century a little bit more peaceful after the wars? Nationalism died down. Where are we now? Hyper-nationalism is popping up all over the place again. And these things swing like a pendulum. They don't belong to one particular country, even if patriotism is part of the Chinese Communist, state manifesto.
I might have said this on the show once before. I don't remember, but in 2018, spent 3 weeks in China. I did at Jilin University, which is like extreme northern China, like almost up by the border of North Korea. They do this, or did, I don't know if they still do or not, this International Education Weeks thing where they bring in a bunch of professors from the US and Canada mostly, to teach these like 1 credit summer courses in English. And so I did one on David Hume at Jilin University, which was a lot of fun, and very, very minimal work. It was like crazily minimal, but there was my favorite moment for that was we're reading Hume's essay about the immortality of the soul, where he says that the problem with heaven and hell is most of us float between vice and virtue. We wouldn't deserve either one. Hume has this nice line about how if you went around the world, try to separate the righteous from the wicked, so you can give the righteous a good dinner and the wicked a good beating. The more you talk to people, about any individual, the harder it would be how to classify them. And so we were talking about this, and one of the students came up to me afterwards and said that in Chinese mythology, there's what's like a 18 level hell that's like very nuanced and avoids this problem. So there you go. But while I was there was a point where there was this, I think he probably lives in the US, but there's this Swedish guy who was like this Marxist anthropologist who was there teaching something for the International Education Week. And he'd heard that students at Jilin had to take that there was like a Marxism, like kind of gen ed requirement, for graduation. And he was super curious about this. And he got, and he set up a meeting with a couple of the Marxism professors. There was like a Chinese student there to translate. I got myself invited along to it because I was, I really wanted to hear this. And it was the weirdest fucking thing. Like he had tried to he kept trying to ask like what they were reading, and it didn't really seem like there were any, primary texts going on there. And and he kept trying to get the guy to talk about economics. It's like he sort of expressed some like vague stuff about, I don't know, speculative bubbles or something. It certainly wasn't anything to the left of what you'd find in a Paul Krugman column.
Right.
And eventually he was like trying to figure out what the fuck they teach in this class. And eventually the student who was translating was like, well, here's what I got out of it. And she was like, well, it's all about like taking responsibility for yourself and doing your part to build up the Chinese nation. It's like, okay, so this is the Marxism class, right? There's two concepts that Marx constantly talks about, individual responsibility and Chinese nationalism.
Duh. Chapter 35, I believe.
It was also covered, I believe, also the Chinese question.
As Reverend Lovejoy says, somewhere near the back. But
that's the thing. You're not really allowed to be a particularly good Marxist within China. No. And it's the same thing as, you were not allowed to be a very good Marxist within the Soviet Union either.
Sure.
There's a particular line that you have to toe, and you have to accept it within the bounds of what's acceptable. And
totally, yeah. Different ways, but yeah, definitely. The last thing, by the way, that the Marxism professor said before somebody or other had to go to class and we had to break up was that he liked 2018. Maybe he thought this was a conciliatory comment for the Americans. He liked Donald Trump more than he liked Obama because Trump seemed like a strong leader.
He saw his handshake.
Exactly. All right, so he's got all this.
King would never be caught dead in a khaki suit either. Come on, give me a break. Yeah, that's freaking hilarious, man. That's really funny. Okay, well, that's one way to judge people. That's interesting. This section that you're hovering over here now is pretty funny because, like, here I have a few things where I'm like, I don't know, this sounds kind of right.
Yeah,
I'm not so sure that I have some pushback on certain concepts here, but about the pan-Asian leftist argument about Europe and the United States and all of this. It's too small for me to read fluently for the.
Oh yeah, so we'll say another pan-Asian leftist argument is that in Europe and the United States, capital reigns directly, with the state apparatus mostly just serving it. Even support for Ukraine is supposedly driven by the military-industrial complex. Let's put a pin in that. By contrast, they insist the movement of capital in China is subordinated to state control and regulation. But with regard to socioeconomic rights, isn't Europe still far more objectively social democratic than China, with the state much more exposed to popular pressures? And yeah, I mean, I think that's basically right. I mean, there's I remember Matt Brunig at the People's Policy Project did this thing several years ago where, he said that broke it down, said that if you just look at the actual amount of GDP that's in the hands of the state sector, it's bigger in Norway than it is in China, which, I think is plausible, given Norway has a still mostly public owned oil company.
Yeah, that's not indicative of the rest of Europe so much.
No, certainly.
No, I think it's. I would say that before but isn't it such and such? Because he's talking about this Pan-Asianist Wang Wei's conception of China, which basically wants it to be more socially democratic than it is in an economic sense. That I think the state really does fall under this way of capital in America, and in Europe more maybe Norway aside, but certainly in the United States, if that's going to be the major pole, and the issue of the polarity of the European continent of the whole is a different story altogether. Which side are they supposed to fall to? Obviously, NATO is under American control, and there's a huge chunk of it that sides with the United States, which is basically who is in control of it more or less. But there's Central Europe and there's parts of Eastern Europe that are still siding with Russia and under their sphere of influence in a way that we can say that Europe is multipolar and there is no main power source in Europe that's really come out from the struggle. You can look between Germany and France are kind of the main competitors there. And, Macron just went to China to speak to Xi Jinping so that France doesn't have to necessarily fall under the sphere of influence of America in terms of, economic and political pressures, and maybe to break away from Germany, who is more closely united with NATO and with the States. So it is an interesting question, but I do think that in terms of like the power of capital over statecraft, in the West, it's very much the case, the first statement that he makes there. And in China, there's no social democratic control over the economy, but when has that ever been part of the mission of China? I think like the state of China controls its capitalists. It allows them to exist, the ones that it's brought up, but it absolutely controls them, disappears them, reforms them. His issue that China is not a socially democratically controlled state where the party is a representative of the people because the people choose who the party is and all of that. That's another story.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's certainly true is that in China, there is more state control and even state planning at the commanding heights of the economy that is remotely normal for a capitalist country in peacetime. I think to find like parallels in the West, we'd have to go probably back to like World War II.
Sure, absolutely. But whether it's like under exposed to popular pressure, no, it's certainly not. It's not about popular pressure. It's a one-party state that represents the will of the people, and it's not in some mutual conversation with them about that.
Yeah. All right. Wang Hui, I'm sure I'm butchering it, other leftist Pan-Asians refer to what they call people's war as a tendency that characterizes specifically Asian emancipatory movements, military operations that reach beyond the state army and involve large strata of the civil population, not least farmers and workers. Examples include the Chinese Revolution, the Vietnam and Korean Wars, and so on. However, doesn't People's War also describe Ukraine's struggle against Russian aggression? There, the state's army's activities are coordinated with local initiatives, self-organization, and forms of improvisation, such as small personal drones. There's something very funny about the phrase small personal drones. But
small personal drones.
Can I just have like a small personal drone?
Yeah, exactly. No, we're going to need to supersize that. We only have the family size drones currently.
I'm not gonna be able to go through it. I had a big lunch,
Yeah, exactly. You can put the rest of the drone in the refrigerator and have it tomorrow. No, that's really funny. There was also a really funny article about a woman in Canada who is working to help Ukrainians get sort of like military surplus and overstock and things like that, including drones that were just meant for personal use, but they're like, no, we can rewire them to be like kamikaze drone bombs and all of that kind of stuff. And it's just a woman who lives, in some random cul-de-sac in a suburb, and just helping the Ukrainians get their hands on these single-size personal drones, more or less, for the sake of
hand
warfare.
drones.
Yeah, exactly.
We should thus qualify earlier statement. China and Russia are also hypocritical in their own way. Their proclaimed respect for national difference is a sham. They clearly prefer different socio-political options around the world, mostly authoritarian ones. When Putin claims that the Islamic states and Persian Gulf monarchies have a right to choose their way of life, he erases the inner antagonisms, tensions, and struggles in those countries. It's actually not where I thought he was going with that.
No, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think the obvious place to say they're being hypocritical in their own way, because I think I don't know that they're really pretending to take into account the internal antagonisms. I think the place that they're being hypocritical in their own way is like, okay, so everybody gets to choose their own, or whatever. The hive mind of the society gets to somehow choose without elections its own form of government. That's nice. So,
yeah.
like, Ukrainians too, right? Or like, Taiwan too, right? Like I think that would be the obvious place to look for hypocrisy in that, conception.
Yeah, it just has no place in realpolitik or in like realist conceptions of the way that states engage with one another. I don't think that we really go about choosing which states have the best ideologies and the least internal antagonisms and any of that. America is also totally guilty of this in the same way. If we're going to talk about hypocrisy, like still working with the Saudis, not just after 9/11, but after Khashoggi and all sorts of things come out, these are not the issues that come to the table when we're considering who to align with militarily, economically, or otherwise. I just like it's really funny, like the things that Zizek seems to hold so dear here, or if he's just going to call them out as hypocrisies. Like, I don't know that they matter as much as he seems to think they do in any sort of global sense. But, we skipped past the part about people's wars and all of that too. Like, there's just a lot of things that I think that he's trying his best to expose and to say this isn't really like they say it is, and this isn't like that, and don't get this and that confused. But at the same time, he's just totally like confounding certain concepts, and it gets very convoluted to the point where it's really difficult to follow what his main argument is from the very beginning of this article to the last, what should be a summary sort of paragraph with his main claim restated. It's really difficult to kind of pin down what it is that he's saying.
As the protests in Iran demonstrate, these inter-antagonisms open up the space for another universalism, one opposed to imperialist universalism, the universalism of the struggle for emancipation or the global solidarity of all the oppressed. It isn't just enough to express sympathy or solidarity with the Iranian protesters. They aren't out there, far from us, part of a different exotic culture. All the babble about cultural difference and specificity used by reactionary forces to justify religious and ethnic oppression is meaningless. We can immediately see that the Iranian struggle is the struggle of all of us, and the same must finally be said for the Ukrainian people's heroic struggle against Putin's monstrous multipolarity. And there is the place where, I know from my perspective, I've got the most disagreement here, at least the clearest disagreement, because there's other stuff that it's like, I think it's just a little bit less clear, at least in my head, what he's saying. And I think part of the problem is that this is all being sort of, he's taking the Putinist way of describing what a multipolar world would or should be or whatever, and he's saying that's bad. And, I concur, it is, but but I think the problem is because it's all being framed, at least as a critique of that, it's a little bit less clear what he's for. And that's so, I hope not like a more consistent unipolarity, but it's, I think he's leaving himself open to that interpretation in some of this. I think that all the stuff about internal antagonisms is good. I think that points in the right direction, that emancipatory left politics should be, siding with, democratic forces within every society. Good. Yes. Co-signed. Right. But where he loses me again again, what that should mean in terms of what we should actually advocate in international relations is not really explored in this article.
Right. Sure.
And is like a big extra question, right? But then where he loses me at the end, this is just, I guess, an obvious point, just goes to our sort of bigger disagreement for a long time is it's the opposite of my norm disagreement, is that very last sentence where he's sort of equating, what he calls the Ukrainian people's, struggle against, Putin's false multipolarity or whatever he says with the protest movement in Iran. And that's where I kind of come to a grinded halt and say, well, no, Because in one case, you're talking about a protest movement against the government of a country within that country.
Domestically, right.
Exactly. And in the other case, you're talking about a war between nation states. And
Yes.
that in, you know, I mean, like, look, Russia and Iran aren't the only places with internal antagonisms. You know, there's like the Economist, I think, had an article a little while back about how crazy conscription has gotten in Ukraine, to the point that, like, if you are a Ukrainian dude between the crucial ages, like, you're afraid to go out to a shopping mall right now.
Yeah,
Because, like,
absolutely.
you know, you're going to get scooped up and, you know, sent off to the front. And, you know, it's like, I don't know. I mean, are we going to describe, like, you know, French conscripts and, you know, in the trenches, you know, to, you know, kick, you know, Germany out of Alsace-Lorraine or whatever is like,
Right.
is that the French people's struggle? You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive post-games on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.